There's something about walking through Timișoara at night. By day, it's light and laughter. Cafés spill onto the sidewalks. The squares glow gold beneath the sun. But when the street's empty, when the last tram sighs past, when the wind curls through the old buildings of the fortress and down toward Freidorf, the city changes. Every brick here remembers something. They say that during the plague, a hospital stood where prayers were louder than screams, and some patients were never meant to leave. They say a tall man dressed entirely in black still waits beneath broken street lamps, watching, smiling, long after midnight. Taxi drivers whisper about a fare they once picked up, and a car that never returned to the depot. In one apartment, there's a blue room no tenant keeps for long. And in Freidorf, people have seen them. Yellow figures, standing together, silent, waiting. I've gathered 5 stories, 5 shadows stitched into the history of this city. Maybe they're just legends. Maybe they're misunderstandings born from fog and fear. Or maybe Timișoara doesn't forget. Walk with me. But if you hear footsteps that don't match mine, don't turn around.
Have you ever stayed late in your old school when the corridors were empty, the lights humming faintly, and every shadow seemed alive? Tell me in the comments, what is the scariest thing you ever experienced inside a school building? I still remember the teacher training school in Timișoara, the pedagogic, the long pale corridors that smelled faintly of chalk and old varnish. Even after all these years, my stomach tightens when I think about one evening in particular. It was supposed to be ordinary, no different than any other days I stayed late for projects or group assignments. But it became the night that changed how I looked at schools, at silence, at history itself. The memory is like a wound that never heals. And yet I feel compelled to share it. Because silence in an empty school is never truly empty. I was 16, restless and ambitious, working on a biology project with 2 classmates, Christina and Mihai. The project was important. We were to present it before the entire class, and we wanted it to be perfect. Our teacher had granted us permission to stay after hours, and so when the halls had emptied and the winter dusk thickened outside, we remained. We sat in the laboratory, surrounded by glass jars filled with preserved organs, some of them floating in yellowing liquid that distorted their shapes. The faint tang of formaldehyde clung to the air, mixing with dust and the wax polish on the floors. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, stuttering every so often. By the time we finished arranging our notes and sketches, it was close to 8 p.m. Outside, rain had started to fall, the drops slashing against the tall windows in steady bursts. The sound was oddly soothing at first, a background rhythm, but then the storm grew heavier, and the rain turned into a furious percussion, rattling the glass like impatient fingernails. The janitor had already done his rounds. His heavy boots had echoed down the staircase, the metallic jangle of his keys fading into the silence. The building belonged to us now. 3 teenagers with our laughter, our notebooks, our whispered plans. But then, as so often happens in horror, something pulled me away. I excused myself to go to the bathroom, which was at the far end of the corridor. The corridor itself was a tunnel of yellow light and shadows, stretching unnaturally, as if the school were subtly bending itself around me. The parquet creaked under every step. My footsteps echoed back at me, hollow and too loud. The storm outside seemed to seep into the building. Water dripped from an unseen leak, steady and slow, like a clock ticking somewhere above. That's when I heard it. A movement, a scrape of wood, the faint creak of a desk shifting against the floor. It came from a classroom I passed along the way. The door stood slightly ajar, just enough to suggest someone or something was inside. My pulse quickened. I told myself maybe another teacher was working late, or perhaps the janitor had returned for something he'd forgotten. But when I peeked inside, the temperature dropped instantly. The air was sharp, biting, as if the windows had been flung wide to the winter night, though they were all sealed tight. My breath fogged the air in front of me, pale puffs drifting in the darkness. And then I smelled it. Not tusk, not chalk, not polish, but something foul, sour, and heavy. The stench of rot, the smell of sickness, as if old sheets soaked in sweat and blood had been left here to decay for centuries. In the farthest corner of the room, crouched low in the shadows, was a pale shimmer of something. Not a body, not a reflection, but a soul-like presence, thin and translucent, flickering like a flame in a draught. I froze. My hands trembled, my breath shallow. The thing slowly raised its head. There was no face, just a hollow where eyes should be, a faint mouth forming a cry I couldn't hear. The silence pressed in, broken only by the relentless rain, and then, in a blink, it was gone, swallowed into the air as though it had never been. I ran. I didn't care how ridiculous it seemed. I ran to the bathroom, then back to the laboratory. My shoes slapped against the floor, each step too loud in the deserted building. But when I pushed the door open, Christina and Mihai were gone. Their notebooks still laid scattered on the desk, pens uncapped, as if they had simply stood up and walked away mid-sentence. The chairs were slightly askew, one still rocking faintly as if it had only just been left. My heart pounded so loud I could hardly hear. I gathered the project materials quickly, stuffing pages into my bag, trying to focus on something normal, something rounding. The rain outside lashed harder against the windows, a relentless drumbeat. That's when it began, the whispers. They slithered from the corners of the room, crawling beneath the tables and from behind the glass jars. They didn't belong to Christina or Mihai. They were older, broken, ragged voices. "My face burns," one whispered, like breath against my ear. "My throat bleeds," groaned another from behind me. "My skin is fire, the boils, the boils." The voices cracked and wept, some high-pitched, others deep and guttural. I could hear wheezing coughs, choking gasps, teeth grinding. A stench followed, the unbearable sting of rotting flesh, of pus and decay, as if the very air had turned into a hospital ward filled with the dying. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the voices drilled inside, scraping across my thoughts, flooding me with visions of sores and fever. I stumbled into the corridor, calling for my friends. My voice echoed, but only the whispers answered. And then I saw it. At the far end of the corridor stood a figure, cloaked in black. Its robe dragged against the floor, leaving a trail of dampness, as if it had walked through centuries of wet graves. But worse was the mask. The beaked plug mask stretched forward unnaturally, its long hollow nose pointing directly at me. The glass eye sockets glinted faintly, reflecting the sick yellow light of the corridor lamps. Around the big space, faint stains, dark reddish-brown, spread into the fabric like dried blood and bile. The figure tilted its head, and the whispers grew louder. "My teeth rot, my stomach bursts, my children are dead." I backed away, but the figure raised a gloved hand, its fingers impossibly long, stretching outward as if to brush my cheek. The sound of the rain outside grew violent, hammering the windows so hard I thought the glass would shatter. The storm seemed to feed the thing, giving it strength. I turned and ran, my shoes hammering against the parquet floor. The corridor seemed endless, stretching on and on, the lamps above flickering one by one as if trying to snuff out the light. I stumbled down the staircase, my bag slamming against my side, the whispers chasing me, echoing against the walls. Behind me I could hear the slow, deliberate steps of the figure descending as well. The exit door loomed ahead. I flung it open, cold night air and rain slapping my face like salvation. I ran into the dark courtyard, soaked instantly, and didn't look back until I was halfway down the street. The school stood silently behind me, its windows black and watching. No figure emerged, no whispers followed. But I wasn't safe. Not yet. When I reached home, still trembling and dripping from the rain, my phone buzzed. It was Christina. Her message was frantic, words spilling without punctuation. "Did you see it too? The man in the mask. I heard them whispering in the library. They touched my hair. I couldn't breathe." Mihai messaged minutes later. "Something's wrong with the school. I saw shadows in the stairwell. They tried to push me down. We need to talk tomorrow." The next morning, pale and sleepless, we met at school before classes. None of us laughed or made jokes, not like before. We looked like children who had glimpsed something too large, too old, too real. Together we went to the history teacher, an elderly man with weary eyes who seemed to know more than he ever said. When we asked him about the school's past, his expression hardened. He leaned back in his chair and spoke slowly, as if unsealing a grave. "This building," he said, "was not always a school. Before it was renovated, before it became a place of learning, it was something else entirely." We leaned forward. "It was a hospital," he said. "During the time of the Black Death, this very building was used to keep the plague victims. Hundreds came here, few left. The corridors you walk every day were once crowded with the dying. Their cries, their pain, it soaked into the walls." He lowered his voice, almost a whisper. "Perhaps it never left. We never worked late at school again." To this day, I cannot walk past the teacher training school in Timișoara at night without feeling the cold hands of history pressing against me. I wonder if anyone else has seen the figure, the mask, the endless corridor. And I wonder how many souls are still trapped inside, whispering their pain for all eternity. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Lady Novelist for more terrifying tales. This was just one of many stories from the Timișoara Horror Stories collection. Watch the other videos if you dare and let the shadows of Timișoara whisper to you as well.
I don't know why I'm writing this now, after so many years. Maybe because the fog returned this morning, curling between the old buildings of the Union Square the same way it did back then. Or maybe because memories, no matter how deeply buried, always claw their way back to the surface when the weather turns cold enough. I was younger then, though not young enough to excuse my forgetfulness. It was a Tuesday. I remember that clearly, because Tuesdays were always the day I brought bread to the Catholic dome. It wasn't much, just a loaf, a gesture, and usually I remembered. Usually. But that morning, the fog was so thick that it erased the world. Timișoara felt suspended, muffled, the pastel facades of the Baroque square transformed into pale ghosts. I wrapped my scarf tighter as I crossed the empty plaza. My boots left small indentations in the frost that clung to the cobblestones. When I reached the cathedral, its massive wooden doors were ajar, as they often were during the early hours. A warm, faintly incense-scented air drifted out, inviting yet strangely heavy. I pushed inside, grateful to escape the cold. The interior was dimly lit. The priest was nowhere in sight, probably in the sacristy, preparing for morning prayers. I stepped forward, reaching automatically into my bag, and froze, empty. I had forgotten the bread, the traditional Catholic offering of bread given to the poor in honor of Saint Anthony of Padua, who is considered the patron saint of the poor and the miracle worker of lost things. A small wave of guilt washed through me. I whispered an apology under my breath, promising myself I'd make up for it the next day. I turned to leave. That was when I felt it. Not a sound, not a shift in the air, not even footsteps. Just a presence, a weight in the atmosphere behind me, as if someone tall and unmoving were standing close enough to touch the back of my coat. My skin prickled. Every hair on my arms rose. Very slowly, I turned. A man stood in the central aisle, halfway between the pews and the entrance. Dressed entirely in black, a long coat, gloves, even a tall, old-fashioned hat that cast his face in shadow. For a moment, I thought maybe he was a priest or a mourner, someone who had arrived silently for prayer. But something was wrong with him. Not visibly at first. Just wrong. Before I could speak, before I could call out, he moved. Not toward me, not away. He simply slipped sideways into the shadow near the small entrance hall, a seamless, gliding motion that made no sound. When I took a hesitant step forward, heart hammering, I saw that the hall was empty. He was gone. There was no breeze to suggest he had left through the doors. No footstep echoing on the marble. Just emptiness. A rational person would have told herself it was a trick of the fog, of the dim light, an optical illusion. And maybe I tried to. But the unshakable sense of being watched, that lingered. I didn't want to leave the safety of the church, but staying felt worse, as if the man might appear beside me again, silent as death. So I took a deep breath, pushed through the heavy doors, and stepped back into the fog. Outside, the square was still empty. The fog swirled between the statues and pastel buildings as if stirred by invisible hands. My boots crunched softly as I stepped forward. I didn't look back. I walked briskly toward my building, a few streets away. The city was barely waking, only the distant hum of a tram and a stray dog nosing through snow. Still, I felt followed. Not in the way you feel when someone is really behind you, but in that primal, instinctive way where your spine knows something your eyes do not. I turned down my street, quickening my pace. My apartment block loomed ahead, squat and gray. I fumbled with my keys, my fingers numb more from fear than cold, and shoved the door open. Once inside, I slammed it shut and twisted the lock. Only then did I allow myself to exhale. I leaned against the door, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No whisper of movement outside. Just silence. I forced a weak laugh at myself. I was overreacting. It was just a strange man in a church. Nothing more. I walked down the narrow corridor to my apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. Everything was as I left it, warm, dimly lit by the timer light in the hall. Safe. I made tea, tried to calm down, even busied myself with laundry. Anything to push aside the absurdity of the morning. Eventually, I settled on the sofa and turned on the TV. That was when I heard it, a step, right outside my door. I muted the TV. Another step, slower this time. Then another, stopping directly in front of my apartment. My breath caught in my throat. The building was old, the floors creaked easily, but this wasn't a building sound. It was careful, deliberate. I tiptoed to the door and looked through the peephole. Nothing, just the dimly lit hallway. But then I remembered the camera by the front entrance, the one connected to a tiny screen beside my coat rack. I turned to it, pulse pounding, and looked. The hallway outside the building's main door was engulfed in fog, the glass pane blurred white. But through it, a shape appeared. A figure standing motionless before the camera, tall, dressed in black. The man from the dome. His face. Dear God, I still see it when I close my eyes. What looked like deep scars ran across his cheeks, jagged and uneven. But it was his eyes, or where his eyes should have been, that froze my blood. His sockets were empty, hollow cavities of darkness staring straight into the camera. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a chair. He tilted his head, slowly, unnaturally, as if listening to my breath from behind the walls. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called the police. My voice trembled as I explained what I saw. They told me to stay inside, that they were sending a car. I watched the camera feed, terrified he would move, but he didn't. He just stayed there, head tilted, the black voids of his eye sockets fixed on the camera. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he stepped backward into the fog. Slowly, one step, then another, until he vanished completely. The police arrived 10 minutes later. They searched the area, checked every entrance, every corner of the building. They found nothing. No footprints in the frost outside. No man in black wandering the streets. Nothing. Still, I refused to stay alone. I packed a bag and went to a friend's apartment across town, locking every window and door behind us. I barely slept, imagining those empty sockets staring at her door next. The next morning, we returned to my place together, accompanied by 2 officers. I wish I could say the nightmare ended then. But when I opened my apartment door, my breath caught in my throat. Everything, every drawer, every cabinet, every piece of furniture was torn apart, papers scattered, books shredded, clothes flung everywhere. The officers looked at me sharply. "Are you sure you didn't stage this?" "Of course not," I gasped. "I wasn't here. You saw me leave." My friend covered her mouth, stepping back, and then we saw it, on the kitchen table. A small, torn piece of parchment-colored paper, smeared with something dark. "Bring bread." The officers looked at each other, baffled. They searched for signs of forced entry. Again, they found nothing. No broken locks, no footprints, no fingerprints. As if the room had been torn apart by something that left no trace. Something not entirely human. They asked if I'd seen the man before. I told them everything, the church, the fog, the camera. But what could they do? Hunt for a faceless phantom? After that day, nothing happened again. I started bringing bread to the church every Tuesday. Sometimes extra loaves. I don't know why it mattered to him, the man in black, the hollow-eyed presence. But I wasn't going to risk finding out. The dome became a place I visited cautiously, reverently. The priest would thank me for the bread with a warm smile. I never told him why I never forgot again. Years have passed since then. No strange figures, no footsteps, no hollow eyes on the camera. But this morning, as I crossed the Union Square, wrapped in my coat, the fog rolled in thick and heavy, just like that day. The church bells echoed faintly across the square. And for a brief moment, a fraction of a heartbeat, I felt it again. A presence, a breath on the back of my neck. I didn't turn. I simply tightened my grip on the loaf of bread in my bag and walked toward the dome. The taxi that never returned. I've always believed that stories are stitched into the land. That's why I started the Timișoara horror stories. At first, it was just a small corner of my website, a side project, an indulgence. I'd share eerie tales from Romania's forgotten villages, stories my grandmother once whispered to me when the wolves howled outside. People liked them. Then they devoured them. My voice, my words, my shadows became an empire of clicks and views. Horror was currency, and I was rich. But nothing, not even the stories I wrote, prepared me for the night I stepped into that taxi. It was late, past midnight, pushing 2 in the morning. My heels clicked against the empty pavement like a metronome marking time for something I couldn't yet hear. I'd just finished a collaboration shoot with another influencer downtown, and though the city was quieter at that hour, it still felt restless, like something breathing beneath the asphalt. I called for a taxi. The app told me he'd arrive in 3 minutes. When the car stopped in front of me, I hesitated. The headlights were too bright, almost accusing, and the driver didn't lean out to greet me. I only saw a silhouette. A man, head lowered, wearing a dark cap pulled down over his brow. The door unlocked with a sharp click. "Good evening," I murmured as I slid into the back seat, careful to keep my tone polite. His only reply was a grunt and a small nod. The smell hit me instantly. Metallic, acrid, like old coins pressed against sweaty palms, or worse, like fresh blood on rusted iron. I thought maybe it was the upholstery, maybe something spilled, but the longer I breathed it in, the more it clung to the back of my throat. "Strange smell," I said lightly, testing him. He didn't answer. His knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. The cap shadowed his face, and I realized with a chill that I couldn't make out his features at all, just the strong line of his jaw. We started driving. The city passed in fragments, empty bus stops, shuttered shops, graffiti that looked like warnings. The streets thinned as we moved further out. I lived in the suburbs, a 30-minute drive at least. Enough time for conversation, but he didn't offer any. He only cleared his throat once before speaking. "I'll need to stop briefly," he said. His voice was low, scratchy, a match striking in a dark room. I frowned. "Stop? Where?" "Won't take long," he muttered. The way he said it left no space for refusal. We turned near the railway station, an area I normally avoided. The concrete blocks of flats loomed like grey tombstones, their windows blind and black. He parked on the curb. The meter kept running. He got out without a word. I watched him cross the street, disappearing into one of the buildings. The lobby light flickered once, then swallowed him whole. I thought of leaving, just opening the door, stepping out, running until my lungs gave out. But I froze. What if he came back and saw me running? What if he followed? Minutes dragged, each second heavy as wet earth. I checked my phone. 3 minutes, 4, 5. Then the lobby light flickered again. He emerged, and my stomach dropped. His hands were covered in disposable plastic gloves, now smeared with something dark. He peeled them off slowly, as if savoring the sound, then tossed them into a nearby bin. He walked back with the steady gait of someone who had just completed a task, a job. I pressed myself against the car door, pretending to scroll through my phone. When he opened the driver's door, the metallic smell intensified. I noticed something else, too. A red blotch on his sleeve, near the elbow. Damp, fresh, blood. My skin went cold. He didn't notice me staring. He just shifted into gear and drove. The ride stretched into eternity. I tried to steady my breathing, to remind myself I had no proof of anything. Maybe he had cut himself. Maybe he worked in a butcher shop, a restaurant, a hospital. My rational mind clawed at explanations, desperate for them. But the metallic tang told me otherwise. We didn't speak again. The silence was a shroud. When he finally stopped in front of my building, I nearly collapsed with relief. The digital clock on the dashboard glared at me. 2:03 a.m. "Thank you," I whispered, fumbling with the door handle. He gave a curt nod. The brim of his cap still obscured his face. I didn't look back as I ran inside. 3 days later, the news broke. A taxi, abandoned in the woods outside the city. A woman's body found stuffed into the trunk. The driver vanished. The car, they said, was borrowed from a taxi firm under false credentials. I sat in front of my screen, numb, rereading the article. The blood, the gloves, the smell. I had been inches from him. Inches. I told no one. What could I say? That I suspected a man with a cap and a stain on his shirt. That I rode in his car and lived to tell the tale. No proof, no evidence, only my memory, as fragile as cobwebs. So I did what I always did. I wrote. The story became one of my most popular pieces in the Timișoara horror stories. Readers ate it up. They said it felt too real. That was because it was. But I never confessed that. Not even to myself. Years passed. My following grew. The series turned into a collection, then a book, then a bestseller. Horror became my brand, my legacy. I moved to Vienna, where my name was printed in glossy magazines, where my voice echoed in theaters during book readings. And yet, some nights, when the wind brushed through the streets just right, I swore I could still smell that metallic tang. It happened on a winter night in Vienna. I'd been at a party, publishers, critics, other writers. The kind of glittering event where laughter felt rehearsed. By the time I slipped outside, snow had begun to fall, settling like ash on the city's quiet bones. I called for a taxi. The car pulled up within minutes. The same model, the same dull color. I hesitated. The back door unlocked. The driver wore a cap. My heart skipped. No, I told myself. Don't be ridiculous. Caps are common. Drivers are anonymous. I slid inside. The smell hit me. Metallic. My pulse thundered in my ears. We drove. The streets blurred. His hands on the wheel looked too familiar. The silence was the same oppressive weight as before. I couldn't breathe. When we reached my apartment, I fumbled for money, desperate to leave. My fingers shook so badly the bills nearly tore. That's when he turned and smiled. His teeth were too wide, too yellow, stretching across his face like a wound. His eyes gleamed from beneath the cap, finally visible, and they locked on mine with recognition. Then he spoke. His voice was the same match-strike rasp I had heard years ago. Do the Timișoara horror stories still keep you awake at night? I wanted to scream, to run, to claw myself out of the car, but I couldn't move. The horror wasn't on the page anymore. It was alive, and it had found me. They say children are like open windows, unlatched, swinging in the breeze, inviting in whatever wanders through the dark. For years, I told myself that the man I heard breathing in the corner of my room was just the house settling. I told myself that the cold hand on my ankle was a trick of the draft. But I'm a woman now, and I know better. The windows never closed. They're still wide open, and the things that crawl through them now. Some of them don't have faces. I grew up in a neighborhood of long shadows and narrow houses at the far southern end of Timișoara. My mother worked 2 jobs, which meant my childhood was spent largely in the company of Andreea. Andreea lived 3 doors down. She was a woman who seemed to be made of grey wool and dried flowers. She wasn't unkind, but she was hollow. She moved through her apartment with a silence that felt heavy, as if she were afraid that a heavy footfall might break the fragile air. Her house smelled of rosewater and something sharper, something like old copper coins. There were lace doilies on every surface, pinned down by heavy glass ashtrays, even though she didn't smoke. It was a house waiting for something that had already left. I was 7 the first time I stayed overnight. My mother had a double shift at the hospital, and Andreea had prepared the blue room for me. It was a small, cramped space on the 2nd floor. The wallpaper was a faded floral pattern that looked, in the dim light, like 1,000 tiny eyes watching me retreat under the covers. "Sleep well, kiddo," Andreea whispered, her hand lingering on the light switch. Her eyes darted toward the empty corner of the room, just for a second, before she clicked the room into darkness. I lay there, the silence pressing against my eardrums. You know that silence? The kind that feels like it's vibrating? Then I heard it. It sounded like fingernails on the floorboards. At first, I thought it was a mouse. I pulled the duvet up to my chin, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. But then, the sound changed. It wasn't a scratch anymore. It was a breath, a long, wet, rattling intake of air. It came from the foot of the bed. I froze. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat felt like it had been swallowed by ice. In the pale moonlight filtering through the moth-eaten curtains, I saw the silhouette of a man sitting in the wicker chair by the window. He was slumped. His head hung at an angle that looked wrong. His chin was pressed deep into his chest, and his arms hung limp at his sides, the fingers brushing the carpet. "Andreea?" he whispered. The voice didn't sound like a human voice. It sounded like wind howling through a cracked pipe. It was thin, desperate, and cold. "Andreea, I'm still heavy. Why am I still so heavy?" I squeezed my eyes shut so hard I saw sparks. I stayed like that for hours, paralyzed, until the sun began to bleed through the fabric of the curtains. When I finally looked, the chair was empty. The sleepovers became a regular occurrence, and so did he. I learned the geography of his presence. He wasn't always in the chair. Sometimes I would wake up and feel the mattress sink behind me as if someone had sat down on the edge of the bed. I would feel the sudden plummeting drop in temperature, the kind of cold that feels like it's stealing the marrow from your bones. I started to feel comfortable in his presence. I wasn't afraid anymore. Once I felt a hand. It wasn't a solid hand. It felt like a layer of static electricity, a tingling, numbing pressure that started at my shoulder and drifted down my arm. And always the whispering. "Tell her I can't get out. Tell her the water is cold." I tried to tell Andreea once. We were sitting at her kitchen table, eating buttered toast. I asked her, "Who is the man in the blue room?" Andrea's teacup stopped halfway to her mouth. She didn't look at me. She stared at a spot on the wall behind my head, her face turning a sickly, translucent white. "There is no one in this house but us, kiddo," she said. Her voice was flat, but her hand was shaking so violently that tea splashed onto the lace tablecloth. Don't ever mention him again. Some things grow if you give them names. I wanted to push further, to tell her that I wasn't just mentioning him. I was breathing the same stale air he was. But the look in her eyes stopped me. It wasn't just fear. It was a desperate, pleading recognition. In that heavy silence, I realized she wasn't protecting me from the truth. She was protecting the truth from being disturbed. I lowered my head and watched a single drop of tea soak into the white lace, spreading like a brown, necrotic bloom. I let the subject drop, burying it deep under a layer of childhood obedience. But as I sat there in the stifling heat of her kitchen, I felt a sudden, icy draft sweep across my ankles. It felt like a greeting. From that day on, I stopped being a guest in that house and became a witness, a silent partner in a haunting that was only just beginning to find its voice. Years passed. I grew up, moved away, and tried to bury the memories of the blue room under the mundane stresses of adulthood. But the open window didn't close. If anything, the latch had broken entirely. I started seeing them everywhere. The woman in the grocery store with the bruised neck who disappeared when I blinked. The child in the park who stood perfectly still while other kids ran through him. I realized then that the man at Andrea's hadn't been a nightmare. He had been a debut. When Andrea passed away last year, I went to her funeral. It was a small, bleak affair. Afterward, I met her sister, a woman named Magda, who was cleaning out the house. We stood in that same kitchen, the smell of copper and roses still lingering. She was a lonely soul, Magda said, folding a lace doily. Ever since
Jon? Jon?
I asked, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. Magda sighed. Her fiancé. It's the tragedy of this house, really. He was a brilliant man, but the darkness got hold of him. Depression is a thief. He took his own life in the upstairs bedroom, the blue room. He used a heavy silk cord from the curtains. Andrea found him the next morning. She never changed a thing in that room. She thought if she kept it exactly as it was, he'd stay. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I'm still heavy. Why am I still so heavy? He was so young, Magda continued, oblivious to my terror. But toward the end, he kept saying he felt like he was already dead, like he was a ghost haunting his own life. Knowing the truth didn't bring me peace. It only validated the horror. Because now
I don't just hear Jon.
I live in a world where the veil is shredded. I see the others every day. They are the stains on the ceiling that move when you aren't looking. They are the voices in the white noise of the television. There are experiences I've had since then, scary ones, foul ones, that I cannot tell you. Not because I don't want to, but because some things are so necrotic, so deeply wrong, that speaking them aloud gives them a shape. I've seen things in the corners of my own bedroom
that make Jon look like a pleasant memory.
I've seen entities with elongated limbs that crawl across the ceiling, dripping a black viscous fluid that smells like rotting meat. I've heard voices that don't ask for Andrea, but call for me. They know I can see them. They know the window is open. Sometimes I'm lying in bed, not in the blue room, but in my own home, miles away, and I feel that familiar sink in the mattress. I feel the static electricity touch of a hand that hasn't felt warmth in decades, and I realize, Andrea didn't just babysit me. She introduced me to the audience that will follow me to my grave. So, if you're listening to this in the dark and you feel a sudden chill, or if you think you see a shadow move in the corner of your eye that doesn't belong to any furniture, don't look. Because once they know you can see them, they never, ever leave. I still smell it sometimes before it comes back to me, the sweetness of overripe apples mixed with iron and damp earth. It arrives without warning, usually at night, usually when the city outside my apartment window goes quiet enough that I can almost pretend I am back there. Back in Freidorf, back when it was still half a village pretending to be a neighborhood, and I was a child pretending not to be afraid. The memory begins with a hook, sharp as a nail driven into the skull. 7 men in yellow, laid out like offerings, their mouths open as if they had been trying to sing. I was 8 years old when they found them. I am 46 now, and I have never truly left that house. Freidorf in the 1980s was a place the city forgot. Timișoara ended somewhere near the tram depot, and after that the roads grew narrow, uneven, more dust than asphalt. Our houses leaned into each other like old women gossiping, their plaster peeling, their gardens fenced with rusted wire and prayer. Chickens wandered freely. Dogs slept in the shade of walnut trees. At night, the darkness was thick enough to feel like fabric brushing against your skin. People say now that Freidorf has always been marginal, but that isn't true. It became marginal. Once, it was a village, proud and self-contained, settled by Swabians long before my grandparents were born. Even in the 80s, traces of that life clung to it. Cellars dug deep into the soil, barns converted into kitchens, wells that no one trusted but everyone still used. And houses. So many houses that didn't quite belong to the present. The yellow house was one of them. It stood at the far edge of Freidorf, where the fields began and the road narrowed into a dirt track that flooded every spring. No one remembered exactly who had built it. Some said a German family before the war. Others said it had been abandoned, taken over, abandoned again. Its walls were painted a sickly yellow that peeled in long strips, like skin after a burn. The windows were always dark, even at noon, and the garden had grown wild, nettles as tall as a man, an apple tree bent under the weight of fruit no one ever picked. We were told not to go near it. So of course, we did. In the summer of 1984, Freidorf was suffocating. The heat pressed down on us, heavy and unrelenting, and the air smelled of dust and sweat and manure. Electricity cuts were frequent. Water sometimes stopped running without warning. Adults whispered more than usual, their conversations dropping into silence when children approached. My mother worked at the factory in the city and came home exhausted, her hands rough, her face permanently tightened by worry. My father drank more than he spoke. At night, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of Freidorf, dogs barking at nothing, trains groaning in the distance, the wind moving through cornfields like a slow breath. That was when the dream started. I dreamed of yellow. Not bright yellow, not the color of sunflowers or school chalk. This was a deeper shade, old and dirty, like walls that had absorbed decades of smoke and secrets. In the dreams, I stood in a room painted that color, barefoot on cold earth, while voices murmured around me in a language I didn't understand. Sometimes there were hands on my shoulders, gentle but firm. Sometimes there was singing. I never saw faces. When I woke up, my nightgown would be damp with sweat and my mouth tasted of metal. I didn't tell anyone. Children in Freidorf learned early what not to say. It was my friend Anka who dared me to go into the yellow house. Anka lived 2 streets over, in a low house with a grapevine climbing the front wall. She was fearless in the way only children can be, convinced that danger was something that happened to other people. We spent our days riding battered bicycles, stealing cherries, and inventing stories about the places adults avoided. "They say it's haunted," she told me one afternoon. pointing toward the yellow house with her chin. They say lots of things, I replied, though my stomach tightened. They say people go in and don't come out. That's stupid, she grinned. Then come with me. We went at dusk, when the heat finally loosened its grip and the shadows grew long. The grass around the house was waist-high, buzzing with insects. Up close, the paint smelled sour, like old urine and mold. The front door hung crookedly on its hinges, a dark gap yawning behind it. See, Anka said, nothing. She stepped inside before I could stop her. I followed, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. The air inside was cool and damp. The floor was packed earth, uneven, with roots breaking through in places. The walls were indeed yellow, darker inside than out, stained in irregular patches. There was no furniture, no curtains, no sign of life, only the faint smell of apples. We explored one room, then another. The house was larger than it looked from the outside, the rooms connected in odd angles, as if it had been expanded without a plan. In the back, there was a door leading down. A cellar. The stairs creaked under our weight. Halfway down, Anka stopped. Do you hear that? She whispered. At first, I heard nothing, then a low hum, almost below hearing, like a distant engine or a chant heard through walls. We should have run. Instead, we went down. The cellar was wide and circular, its walls reinforced with old bricks. The ceiling was low, supported by thick wooden beams blackened with age. Candles stood in niches along the walls, unlit, their wax melted into thick, uneven drips. In the center of the room was a symbol scratched into the dirt floor. I didn't know then what it meant. I only knew it made my head hurt to look at it. The humming grew louder. It wasn't coming from the room itself, but from somewhere beyond it, through a narrow passage at the back, partially hidden by a hanging cloth. Anka reached for it. That was when the singing started. Voices rose together, deep and steady, male voices harmonizing in a way that felt practiced, ritualized. The language was unfamiliar, harsh consonants, drawn-out vowels, but the rhythm was hypnotic. I felt my feet moving forward without my permission. We pushed the cloth aside. The room beyond was lit by candlelight. 7 men stood in a circle, their backs to us. They were all dressed the same. Yellow shirts, yellow trousers, yellow cloth wrapped around their heads. The color was brighter here, almost glowing in the dim light. In the center of the circle something knelt. I couldn't see it clearly at first. Only a shape, small and hunched. A child. My breath caught in my throat. One of the men turned his head slightly, and I saw his face in profile. His eyes were closed. His lips moved with the chant. His expression was peaceful. None of them noticed us. The chanting grew louder, faster. The men began to sway, their movements synchronized. The child in the center rocked back and forth, whimpering. Anka squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. I don't like this, she whispered. Neither did I, but my legs wouldn't move. One of the men stepped forward, raising a knife. Its blade caught the candlelight, flashing white. That was when I screamed. The sound shattered the rhythm. The chanting stopped abruptly. All 7 men turned to look at us. Their eyes were open now. They were yellow too. Not the whites, the irises, stained the same sickly shade as their clothes, as the walls, as my dreams. Someone grabbed me from behind. The world tilted, spun, went dark. When I came to, I was lying on the cellar floor. The candles were out. The room was empty. Anka was gone. I screamed her name until my throat burned, but only my own voice answered me. I stumbled up the stairs out of the house into the night air and ran. Adults descended on the yellow house the next morning. Someone had found Anka wandering near the fields, dazed, unable to speak. She was taken to the hospital in the city. She never came back to Freidorf. They found the men that afternoon. 7 of them laid out in the cellar, dressed in yellow, dead. The police came. Men in uniforms asked questions no one knew how to answer. The official story was vague, some kind of cult, a mass suicide, ritual gone wrong. The Romanian word nebuni, crazy people, was used often. No one mentioned a child. No one mentioned chanting. No one asked me why my nightgown was stained with dirt and candle wax. The house was sealed. Later it was demolished. A block of flats stands there now, its concrete foundation poured over whatever remains beneath. But the story didn't die. It became an urban myth. People still whisper about the yellow men of Freidorf. They say 7 workers disappeared one summer, found dressed alike, victims of a secret sect. They say it was connected to old pagan rituals, to something buried under the village long before Timișoara swallowed it. They don't know the truth. Or maybe they know pieces of it and are too afraid to assemble them. I know what happened. Or at least, I know enough. Anka never spoke again. She lived the rest of her life in institutions, her eyes always unfocused, her fingers twitching as if tracing symbols in the air. She died young. I went to her funeral and stood by the grave, listening to the priest talk about peace and rest, and wondered if she had ever escaped that cellar in her mind. I tried to forget. I left Freidorf as soon as I could, went to university, built a life. But the dreams followed me. The smell, the singing, and the yellow. It wasn't until years later, after the revolution, when archives opened and people started talking more freely, that I learned what the men were trying to do. Freidorf had been built on something old, older than the village, older than the Swabians. The land itself was wrong, layered with beliefs that predated Christianity, that spoke of cycles and offerings and guardians that slept beneath the soil. The men were descendants of those who had stayed. They believed the guardian was waking. They believed it demanded a child. What they didn't know was that the ritual required a witness. Someone pure enough to see but not chosen to die. Someone like me. I was there, in that cellar, when the guardian stirred. I felt it, a presence pressing against my thoughts, seeping into my memory. When the men realized I was there, that I had seen, it was too late. The ritual had been broken. They paid for it with their lives. But the guardian was not put back to sleep. It was bound to me instead. That is why I still smell apples and iron at night, why yellow makes my vision blur, why sometimes, in the quietest hours, I hear singing from beneath the city, 7 voices calling my name.
Freidorf
may be marginal now, a forgotten edge of Timișoara, but beneath it, something old still waits, and it remembers me.